In this map of responsibility, I'll share the different links that I can make between the word and ultimately end up in a place with more clarity about how to go about enriching our lives through the ritual of responsibility. So what is responsibility? And it's very easy. It's explained in the word. It is the ability to respond. But of course, to take responsibility, we not only have to be able, but willing to respond. And this brings up an awareness of limitation. Because if we learn tomorrow that a giant asteroid is heading towards the planet, the question is, can we respond? Do you and I have any way to respond? And we might be able to contact, local government and say, is there anything I can do to help? But it's unlikely we can respond in our current situation. However, if you hear the smoke detector and you hear there's some toast burning upstairs, most of us could respond to that, assuming we're not in a wheelchair and unable to mount the stairs, etc. And so there's an infinite number of things that we can respond to, and of that infinite number of things, there are a certain amount that we presently can respond to. And we get into the nitty-gritty of our limitations there when we ask, to what? Can you be responsible? For what? For an asteroid hitting the planet in 3 days? For paying my rent on time? For what? And then when? My landlord just asked me to move my boat in 24 hours. And I said, no, I can move the boat, but not in 24 hours. And what's more, it's completely unreasonable to just throw this at me. And so he backed down, and I said, I will move it by the end of the month. And so when is, but of course, depending on our ability and how big our resources are, if I owned a boat company and had various slips around ready to take a boat and, had numerous staff and assistants around, I could have the boat moved in 20 minutes. And so our ability to respond, which correlates to power, because power is the ability to act, responding is a form of action. To respond is to act in response to something. To have the ability to respond is power. So again, quick cell phone connection, 3 or 4 staff standing by to do whatever last-minute chore, and I can respond in 20 minutes. And then how? How can I respond? Do I have to go meet someone? Can I pick up a phone? Do I have video calling? Do I have a buzzer to press? What are all the different options of responding that are available? And part of, obviously, the question behind any action is why. Why would I respond? And any of us that have the next, leg down from power, which is freedom. When you have power, you have freedom. When you have the ability to respond, you have power and freedom. And so the question is, well, why do you want that? Why do you want to act? And when you have freedom, the obvious answer is to in some way better our lives. Now, this can get twisted a little bit in terms of something like revenge, where you have freedom and what you want more than anything is revenge. But even that is, well, why? Why do you want revenge? Well, I want to get rid of this horrible, helpless feeling that I've had ever since you hurt me and just walked away because I couldn't do anything to stop you. And just that powerlessness has been grating on me. Now I've got some power. I want revenge. Okay, well, what do you want then? Well, after I've gotten rid of that horrible feeling and clarified that, no one's going to treat me like that, well, then what do you want next? Well, it's not fun to just, go around in spite. And so, what do you want next? Well, I want some money, or, okay, so, and then what do you want with that? Well, I want to wake up each morning and do something I enjoy. So it always comes back to some positive thing. We want power so that we can have freedom, and we want freedom so that we have choice, and we want choice so that we can choose something that betters our life. And so there's a connection between the ability and willingness to respond and stepping closer to the lives that we want. Then, of course, where? Can you give me a back rub? Okay, I can respond. I'm not very good at it, but I can do that. Are you willing to give me a back rub? Well, might have to make it a trade. I'll give you one for 10 minutes and then you owe me one. Or, okay, I'm willing to. You've been very nice recently. Here's a back rub. But where? A back rub next door? A back rub right here? A back rub on Mars? Because this all ties in with limitation. We have a limit to our ability to respond. And with whom? Who are we responding to? Obviously, we have the limit of being us, but who are we responding to? There's also a limit, partly based on location, partly based on time. It's not as easy to respond to a call to freedom from Henry Thoreau when he's dead. So, we have these limits of what, when, how, why, where, and who. Now, obviously, the wider the range here, the more responsibility, the more ability we have to respond. If I have a private jet, I might be able to respond within 24 hours anywhere around the world. If I don't, I might be able to respond within a week anywhere in the world, or at different times. So there's a finite ability to respond, which is the size of our responsibility, which correlates to the size of our power, which correlates to the size of our freedom, and which ultimately correlates to the size of our well-being. That's what we use our freedom to move towards within the framework of our paradigms and values. So one of the first things to focus on or look at is that when we increase our choices, our ability, when we, if you have 2 flavors of ice cream and you have the ability to act and go to the ice cream parlor, and you have the $3, well, you have the ability to pick strawberry or vanilla, whatever the 2 flavors are. If you take action to expand that choices, I'd like to order a special case. Would you mind stocking more things? I'll come in this amount, or so, there are things that we can do to expand the range of choices that we can make. And with each expansion in choice, for example, if we get good grades, we have a wider selection of universities that we can go to. If we speak English well, we have the possibility of teaching English. And so, when we expand our choices, we increase our ability to respond. I don't speak English at all. Well, then you can't respond to someone crying for help in English. You can't be responsible because you don't know what they're talking about. So there's a connection between responsibility and the range of choices we are capable of making. And this also ties in with the ability to imagine, because there's nothing stopping me from digging a 10-foot hole in the ground a few feet near my house and lining it with interesting mosaics and going down and chanting in that hole. But if I don't imagine that it's a possibility, then I don't have the ability to respond with that idea. Someone says, do you have any great place you can chant with mosaics? And I say, no, absolutely not. I don't have the ability to respond. If I have an idea, I say, well, I don't currently, but I have a place near my house you could dig a 10-foot hole in the ground and you could respond to that. You could develop that. And the point of pushing the boundary on these examples is to, when you understand the extremes, then the more mundane and, normal interactions become clear. When you understand the extremes, the middle becomes more evident. Now, there's also a connection between choice and impact, meaning my choice to make this video has the impact that you're watching it. My choice to make it in the way that I'm making it has impact on you. Positive, negative, both, in this area, in that area. There's a variety of impacts with each choice that we make. There's also the circle of impact, which correlates with the circle of responsibility. So at the center you have the self. Maybe you have a partner, a wife, a husband, partner. Maybe you have a family or extended family, your community. Can go out as far as you want, your planet. There's a sphere of influence. And obviously you can't take responsibility. You can't respond to an asteroid if you can't respond to your own ability to get out of bed or to stay alive. Meaning if you can't respond to keep your body alive with oxygen and food and this, and that, the other, if you don't have the ability and the willingness to respond, then you're dead. And so you have zero impact on the asteroid, hitting the planet. Now, if you respond and respond very well at an individual level and keep yourself alive and healthy, etc., and you take good care of your partner, one of the things that correlates with the degree of responsibility is the degree of healthy leadership. And the reason is simple. When there's a crisis going on, and that's the time when leadership is most appreciated, who do you want to respond to the crisis? Someone who is powerful, who has a lot of choices, who's taken excellent care of themselves and partner and family and community, and they have the money, they have the skills, they have the coordination, and when they step up to the plate, the crisis goes away. Is that the kind of person you want as a leader? Well, it's intelligent to pick leaders who, when you follow them, take you to good places. There's something wrong with your leadership selection system if you pick leaders and then follow them and you end up worse off than you were 4 years ago. Well, that's not a very good choice. So, and you certainly don't tend to do that consciously. You don't say, oh, here's someone I'm sure will make my life miserable, let me follow them. No, you pick someone that you think will make your life beautiful, that will create something that you can't do on your own or wouldn't tend to happen if you didn't follow the leader or participate in the group dynamic. So, to the degree that people demonstrate their capacity to lead, it is to the degree that they demonstrate their ability and willingness to respond in a way that benefits the group. And this is particularly the case in, of course, democracies. Dictators may lead by demonstrating the ability and willingness to kill off anyone that opposes them. And so whether they're particularly, beneficial in other areas or not, the threat of imminent execution is one way to secure submission. And so the ability and willingness to intimidate a certain percentage of people can result in a leadership dynamic. But in a democracy, people vote for the people they believe will take you in the best direction, because everyone ultimately wants to end up with more well-being. Nobody's trying to end up with a worse form of cancer than they already have, with food that tastes even worse than the crap they're already eating, with atmospheres that smell worse than the air that they're breathing. No one's working hard to feel worse. We're working to the extent that we're working either to avoid feeling bad or to feel better in some way. And that's why we want freedom, is so that we can choose the choices that we believe will lead in the direction of our well-being, and once our well-being is satisfied, lead out to other people's well-being. So if we look then at power for a moment, power, the ability to act, the ability to respond, also the ability to initiate, we also see that knowledge is a form of power. If I know that a certain person is going to be at a crossroad at 1 minute to 2 p.m. walking, and if I know that that person has information about something I need, or if I know that that person needs a service that I can provide, that gives me the ability to act. That information gives me the ability to go be at the crossrock and say, hey, I can provide that service that you're looking for, which in turn may give me money, which in turn gives me an ability to act in terms of spending all that money. So knowledge correlates with power, but so does the right. Having the legal right also correlates to power. There's a different ability to respond, particularly in countries of law, if you're outside the law or inside the law. So the more rights one has, in whatever circle that you're in, if you're in a criminal circle and and this person has the right to this job and this thing, then that right correlates with power, as does knowledge correlate with power. So one of the things that also ties in with responsibility is the child, adolescent, and adult dynamic. Because a child has a very limited ability to respond and tends to develop a coping mechanism of pleasing and deferring to whoever has the power in their group. A 2-year-old is never going to have more strength than 20, 50-year-olds, that are in and around the neighborhood. And so the 2-year-old defers in a variety of ways, or is deferred if they may be tantruming or whatever, but they're still bundled up and put in the crib. And the will of the larger bodies dominates that environment, irrespective of any positive or negative motive. The stronger mass dominates the child. And so, in general terms, the child survives, meets its human needs for survival, security, love, and belonging with compliance or being complied, just pushed in with the superior body mass into whatever is the protocol of the culture or cult in which that child is being raised. And so the child doesn't really develop and have the ability to respond very much. The adolescent is generally in rebellion and hates responsibility because it doesn't yet know how to fully take care of life, but it hates all the corruption and oppression and lies and all the things they don't want to be doing and all the awkwardness of being a teenager, etc. And so a teenager hates responsibility because it's always like who's responsible for this is something to be blamed about, or someone who's going to get in trouble, and a teenager can't argue with the teacher and change the school system or change the quality of TV programming or change the speed of their internet connection on their own because they don't have money. And so for a teenager and a child, responsibility is more like a burden, particularly if you have immature parents, that are dumping their burden, blaming the child and the teenager every time things go wrong and making all the choices with their superior legal, financial, and physical authority. And so, responsibility is not fun for a child or adolescent. But as an adult, the ability to respond, the ability to act, the ability to freely decide our lives is a wonderful resource. And the more responsibility, the more ability to respond we can create, the more willingness to respond, the more power, the more freedom, the more well-being we ultimately create. And that can be big or small, but the direction towards the ability and willingness to respond in the way that creates the well-being that we desire is a profound expression of intelligence. Intelligence, the efficient transformation of energy, time, money, and natural resources into well-being, that which brings us pleasure, brings us security, helps to develop us as human beings, brings us well-being. So the direction towards power, the direction towards freedom, the direction towards the ability and willingness to respond. Now, we often kind of ask this question, who's responsible, synonymous with who's to blame? Now, who's responsible is anyone who is able to respond. I mean, if you ask a snail, please help me push this truck, the snail doesn't have the ability to respond. If someone knocks on the door and says, can you help me jumpstart my car? you have the ability to respond. And you may or may not have the willingness to respond, but the fact that you have the ability to respond is a good thing. The fact, it's great. It means you have legs. It means you have a door. It means you can speak English with the person asking you. Now, whether or not you respond and go out and stop what you're doing and go do that, or respond by saying, no, I'm busy, that is, a matter that will have impact in both ways. Obviously, if you get known as the neighbor that never helps anyone when they're in a bind, when you're going to be in a bind at some point, and you're going to receive a less warm reception than if you're showing up when when others needed help. And so there's a reciprocity in the element of willingness. Everyone may have the ability to help you, but do they have the willingness to help you will depend on your impact on them. It will depend on how much trauma they're in. People who are in trauma are very self-centered, and so even if you have helped them many times, if they're in trauma, they will be self-centered and may not help you. And yet, in general, building goodwill with trustworthy people around you increases the group's ability to respond. And going back to the awareness of limits, what you can respond to will be smaller than what a larger group can respond to. And so what you can respond to is much smaller than what your community can respond to. What your community can respond to is smaller than what your country can respond to. What the country can respond to is smaller than what all the countries can respond to together. And so one of the things that increases power, increases freedom, and increases well-being is moving towards group cohesion, which is the ability and willingness to respond in such a way that builds trust, in such a way that creates flow between people. Obviously, to interrelate is vulnerable. So if every so often, for no particular reason, you take out a gun and start shooting people near you, next time you say, come on, let's get together and go, clear the woods because there could be a fire, they're not so interested because you're not trustworthy. So they don't want to be vulnerable. So the potential of the group is reduced often to the lowest common denominator. If there's one thief in the neighborhood, everyone has to get alarms. And so there's a reduction to the lowest common denominator, which is one of the reasons why demonstrating our ability to respond to those most vulnerable in our community is such a good idea. In other words, if there's one person in your neighborhood who can't get it together to respond to their life, they can't take the steps that would allow them to get a job and buy the house, etc., and so they're not surviving. And in a materialistic culture like ours, when they're not able to buy the items that give social ranking, they don't fit in, and they feel rejected and shamed. Well, someone who's not surviving, who doesn't fit in and feels rejected and shamed, is the most likely to bring a disease into a community. Their immune system is suppressed by the shame of exclusion. Our homeless, for example, often bring diseases into the rest of the community because their immune system is suppressed through emotional abuse, through physical stress, through the absence of being able to nourish themselves, having to eat out of garbage bins. So our homeless become the carriers of disease, but then everyone else has to be immunized for more money than it would take to provide care for that homeless. Or when someone is, feeling miserable and upset and no one to talk to, etc., and they act out in anger or revenge or something in the community, then everyone has to spend more energy protecting themselves than it would take to understand that person's feelings and help them respond to the situation that they're in. And so when we respond in the way that creates the probability of group cohesion, then the probability field expands to that which includes the possibility that the group can achieve working together, which is always bigger than the possibility of what an individual can achieve working alone. And I don't say it's always actually bigger, but as a probability field, the probability field is bigger. It's perfectly possible to have 5 people achieve less than one person working alone without being bothered by the other 4. But it's also the case that if 5 people learn the art of untapping their potential and relating, which is why relationship skills are so important, the probability field is exponentially bigger of what 5 people can do than what one person can do. And when you talk about probability as a field, you're talking about power again, which is freedom, which is well-being. The well-being is exponentially bigger that can be released by individuals working in synergy as opposed to as isolated individuals. Now, what is it that we're responding to? And I want to take a moment to look at impact as it relates to responsibility, the ability to respond. So, and tie in with trust. So if I drive my car into the corner of your house at 40 or so miles per hour, there's a pretty good chance that the corner will cave in. Maybe a little bit of the roof will sag as the 2x4s or 2x6s start snapping, but as the car keeps going in, actually dragging the roof down a little bit. Furniture, glass, etc. on the other side of that wall on shelves shatters. A hole is open, a security breach, cold air rushes in. Maybe there's an electrical short that risks fire or blows some fuses. And so these are the impacts of my driving in to the corner of your house. And the obvious question is, if I drive off without doing what it takes to restore that corner, will you trust me? Well, trust to what? If you look at the map on trust, trust is a very nuanced thing. But will you trust me to be a safe person, to have a car near your house? Well, presumably not. Can you respond to that? Meaning, do you have the ability, as I drive off and don't respond with willingness and ability to fix the damage, do you have the ability to fix the damage? And that's you taking responsibility for my mistake. Presumably it's a mistake. Most of us don't drive into our friends' houses on purpose. But you do have the ability and probably the willingness to sort out your house. because that's an intelligent thing to do. It's not going to be very fun to live in that house cold and electrical shorts and shattered. So you're going to clean up the mess, even if I drive off. Or let's take, a hit and run that runs over your kid. Are you going to just leave the kid there screaming because it's that person's job to take responsibility and you're not going to do their job? Presumably the love you have for your kid is going to trump your righteousness, and you'll get them up and you will respond. You will respond. You will take your ability and willingness to respond. Your kid goes to the hospital, is taken care of, and then you will worry about, be nice if that hit and run driver could pay the medical bill if they have the ability. Do they have the ability? Do they have insurance? Do they have any money? And this brings in the fact that the more powerful you are, the more ability you have to act, the more responsible you can be. Because that hit and run driver that doesn't have insurance, that doesn't have any savings, and that doesn't have any useful skills is not going to be an asset in repairing the damage they cause by driving over your child. So they can't, in their present state, take responsibility. How can they? But if they learn skills, if they save up money, if they apply those skills, if they get a job, if they buy insurance, if they do it in installment plans, then they can. So you may not be able and willing to respond, but you can take the steps that will lead you closer to being able and willing to respond, as can anyone else. It's a direction. The more things we learn, the more growth steps we take, the more we are capable of responding, of taking responsibility. So that's physical impact. And obviously, if you understand that one person in your group causes physical damage, driving over your child, banging into your house, leaving the garage door open when they were over visiting, and so stuff gets stolen, that's all physical impact. And one of the dynamics with relationship on an emotional level, if you've got two independent people and one says, let's have a relationship, the relationship doesn't begin unless the other person says yes. If two people say yes, you have a relationship. If one person says no, you don't. And there are certain synergies in groups that just don't work if one person leaves. The CEO of a company walks away, or the lead singer in a band. When John Lennon walked away, when John Cleese walked away, there's the group fell apart. And so the synergy wasn't sustainable without one. Certainly when one part of a couple walks away, the other person can't have a couple without the one that walks away. Two to say yes, one to say no. And this is where we come back to impact. Are you going to say yes, or is someone going to say yes to you if you've caused physical impact and haven't repaired it? Well, not if you have a choice and in general terms, and you're certainly not going to feel that great about continually cleaning up someone else's mess. Particularly, if it's a child, we have great forbearance, and patience, because we really get that they can't do it. A 2-year-old knocks over our vase, we may scream, that was my grandmother's vase, But if we're at all intelligent, we don't beat the child because they lack the ability to respond. So they can't be responsible. And we are, hopefully, capable of not inducing PTSD in a 2-year-old, because that will have impact. that will far outlast the vase. So this is physical impact, and one of the things that all of us appreciate about our friends and partners is if they're continually growing. Growing what? Their sphere of influence. Why? So that they have more power. Why? So that they have more freedom. Why? So they can be more responsible. When your girlfriend that's been bumming off you for 5 years gets it together to finish her degree and gets a job, she is now able to respond to the monthly expenses and lighten the load, make that a more equitable partnership, and vice versa. So we all, and it is in everyone's interest, that we become more and more powerful, more and more free, mentally, physically, financially, and emotionally. We could add logistically, or we can add more distinctions in that. But, when someone has no freedom or no power to regulate their emotions, they have a fit. That's it for the evening. They had a fit. Now, someone who is responsible, how much ability and willingness to respond. You've got some people that do their little thing, they clear out the breath, they open a chakra, and they're back. They were able and willing to respond emotionally. And we appreciate that. If you're hiring an actress, you've got a $200 million film. When Woody Allen cheated on his co-star, absolutely horrible. There's nothing worse than being cheated on with your daughter. And yet, she finished the last bit of the movie, demonstrating that she had the ability and willingness to regulate her emotions and also to transcend her personal feelings to consider the group, to consider the investors in the film, to consider her future career. Because obviously, if you have the choice between two actresses in a $200 million movie, and one of them is going to finish the set, and you've seen that time and time again, and the other one, it's about 50-50, and there's going to be antics and this and that and the other. Who are you going to choose? You're going to choose the one who has the ability and willingness to respond to crisis and upset in a way that's good for the group. So you have an appreciation. We all admire and instinctively associate ourselves, when possible, with people who are able and willing to respond. Because there's no downside. I mean, even if someone isn't willing to respond, there's no downside to them being able to. Even if a billionaire doesn't always pick up the check, it doesn't hurt that they could in a pinch. And so the ability and willingness to respond correlates with power, with freedom, with releasing the probability field of the group. It correlates with value. Your ability and willingness to respond correlates to your value on a masculine level. You have your core presence, your being. We all have that. It's an innate part of just being human. A 1-year-old child has a presence and a being and a soul that's no more or less valuable than anyone else's. But a 1-year-old child is not going to put out a 3-story fire and save someone's life. A 40-year veteran firefighter might do that. And a 5-year-old is not going to be the heavyweight champion of the Olympics or whatever the game is. A 30-year-old bodybuilder might. And so the value is correlated to our ability and willingness to be responsible. Your value on a masculine level as a person is determined by other people's perception. And of course, value is in the eyes of yourself, your value to yourself. Obviously, if you look at yourself and say, gee, you've created a life where you can do anything you want and anything that I want. And all these people around me, they can't. I can't ask that person to do this for me, but I can ask myself and I'll do it. I can't ask that person to do that for me, but I can ask myself and I'll do it. I'm more valuable to myself if I am able and willing to respond in a way that creates more well-being. And the way that you and I look at other people from a masculine perspective. You've got a few billion, you know how to do everything and take care of yourself. You can take care of your emotions. Meaning, I don't have to worry about you breaking down every time I open my mouth, this and that, the other, because you've got that handled. You can step out of the room, regulate, cry for a few minutes, make a healthy choice, excuse yourself from the evening. But someone doesn't have to come and clean up after you. You can take care of their impact on you and your own impact on yourself and life's impacts, and there you are. You're able and willing to respond. And this also brings in the distinction between appearance and actuality. And this ties in with sustainability because, let's say you're the one always picking up the bill, but you're racking up credit card debts. Well, at some point, that's going to explode. You're going to go bankrupt and all that, and you can't do that. So you have less ability to respond sustainably than if you've got a few billion and are always picking up the tab. And so there are short-term patterns of responsibility, like a 5-year-old offering to do all the housework and this and that and the other, and then developing a stoop and needing to go to hospital because they don't have the body for it and stuff. And so we particularly appreciate the kind of competency and responsibility that doesn't go on and then suddenly collapse, because that's the difference between a wise and sustainable level of responsibility and something that's unsustainable and thus volatile. So the ability and willingness to respond mentally, emotionally, and physically determines our value to ourselves and other people on a masculine dimension. You want to go out sailing? They know all about sailing and wind. A storm comes up, you don't have to tell them a quick course on hurricane training. They know to pull the sails down, they know this. They have the ability and willingness to respond. And we admire the competency, the value in that ability and willingness to respond. You go out to a social group, they have the ability and willingness to respond in that situation in a way that delivers well-being. If we value our personal image, they have the ability to raise political capital. The ability and willingness to respond in a way that generates well-being sustainably and competently determines the value. So there's an incredible honor. You know, you look at someone like Elon Musk, and he read every book in the library in his teens. He was busy designing, rockets. He worked his ass off to create Zip2, sold that to Hearst Communication, I think it was, for a few million. Then he started PayPal, sold that for $400 million. Then he started PayPal or SpaceX, Tesla, and SolarCity. Turned all of them into global winners. And then he started the Boring Company and inspired Hyperloop and is pushing to bring the species to Mars. Why? Because he has the ability and the willingness to do so. He has the ability and the willingness to do so, and it's growing, meaning it's an exponential curve. So our value correlates to our responsibility. And the key is to pay attention to the direction and the pace and the relevance, meaning having the ability and respond, or the ability and willingness to talk hamster to your cousin's hamster, is an ability and willingness to respond. It's not necessarily going to help you get a promotion. So focusing, and this brings in the question of intelligence, the efficiency with which energy is transformed into well-being, well, it relates to questions. What is the ability that I could develop, tying in with education as well, what is the ability that I could develop that would be most useful to the planet, to the family? What is the ability that I could develop that would be most useful? See, the adult flourishes on this expansion of responsibility, the ability to respond. If you have the ability, presumably if you develop that ability, you also have a certain ability or willingness to utilize that ability. You didn't just study to be a rocket scientist so that you could sit there doing nothing. You studied because you were willing to do rocketry. And so you just need to then find a niche in which doing rocketry is rewarded, is valued, and continually develop your competency, which will develop your value, your ability and willingness to respond. Glenn Shotwell, in her work with SpaceX, developed her ability and willingness to buffer between Elon's and the larger core of SpaceX's customers. And her ability and willingness to do that makes her the second most valuable person in SpaceX. Her ability and willingness to translate Elon into language that everyone else can relate to is an incredibly powerful ability that she is willing to express. So she has enormous value, financially and otherwise, within that organization. Someone's ability to listen and understand the other person is an incredible ability that if they use that ability with willingness, they can create relationship, a relatable pattern. They have the ability to facilitate more attunement. Another ability. So the path to responsibility is a path of developing abilities. Developing abilities is a path to responsibility, choice, power, freedom, and well-being. And it is the path of the adult. I can, so I will. And there are enough irresponsible people who do not have the ability or willingness to respond, people that'll drive into your house without more, they're in debt. They don't even have a net worth to pay for the repair. What are they going to do? You're going to kill them? Or are you going to use your ability to earn, etc., to fix their mistake so that you have a whole house again and move on? You have the ability and willingness to respond. And that's a tremendous boon. That's a tremendous gift for any man or any woman to develop their abilities. And as you develop your abilities and your reputation for using them within the community for well-being, your circle of influence will grow. Why? Because you will be in a leadership position by default. When someone who is highly competent and ethical says, "Let's do this, please help," people gather around. When someone with no competency say, "Let's do this," the idea may or may not be extracted, but they're not elevated into a leadership position. So, the path of responsibility, power, freedom, well-being, value, money, prestige, competency is all the same. It's a path of learning abilities that are useful. I did a map on education with that in mind. It's about expanding choices with those abilities. When you get a passport, for example, you act to get the passport. You now have the ability to travel instantly, to various places around the world. If you get visas, you now have the ability to go to the places with those visas. You've expanded your ability. So you learn and take steps to grow abilities. And then you learn and take steps to grow those abilities further. One of the things that's interesting about the Pareto principle is that the difference in salary and the difference in value from the person who's number one and the person who's number three is enormous. There's an exponential curve. If you were the one who almost won the Nobel Peace Prize, it's meaningless. If you won, it changes your whole life. If you were the person who almost did a show, but you didn't, versus the person who did the show and got noticed, if you're the third best cellist in the world, in some areas it's not as sharp, a drop. But still, the competition for the number one in any field is enormous. Sherlock Holmes was the only consulting detective in the world. Dealt with monarchs and all that, and obviously we're dealing in fiction here, but you get the idea. The value goes up. If you can be that one in some area that's useful, the one that is useful. And obviously the ability to define and find an ability that nobody knows that they value is that much more valuable. Obviously, Apple and Steve Jobs, did a lot of copying and borrowing and, and following. But the way that Apple took things at the right time, the iPhone, the iPod, and brought them into full view in an excellent way, is what made Steve Jobs valuable. His ability to take media players that had been fumbling around for a decade or so and say, okay, now's the time, now's the price point, we're going to do it better than anyone else, the iPod. He had an ability to create something and present it in a way that we could understand the value. And then that is incredibly valuable. So which means you don't have to be the best cellist in the world. Steve Jobs wasn't the best cellist. He was the best at selling things you didn't know you wanted or needed until he put them before your eyes. Which means there's an infinite number of other things that we don't know that we want and value until they're put before our eyes as technologies in a wide variety of sectors. If you have the ability to engender the trust, and I talked about the physical impact. Obviously, we don't trust people who bang into houses and drive away. There's different levels of trust. We don't trust the driving of people that bang into houses regularly, whether they clean up the mess or not. We don't trust their driving. But we don't trust their ethics if they go away without acknowledging and dealing with it. And we don't trust their finances if their response is, I'm really sorry, it's my fault, and I have no money to sort it out, so you're going to have to take care of it. Bye. So that's physical impact. But we also have emotional impact. We all have emotional architecture, associations in our body, things that we're sensitive to, things that were important to us, things that we value. And people can drive right into those. And they can do hit and runs. And one of the things about an emotionally illiterate culture is we don't have the technology in this culture to do competent, systematic repair of those damages with excellence. It's not taught. We teach carpentry. There's a specialist to call. There isn't someone to call that say, I just made this person feel terrible. I don't know what to do. But I'll pay you whatever it takes. Go over there and make them feel good. I'll be right on it. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm not the expert in repairing this emotional damage I've just caused, but I've just called in an expert. When would you like them to meet? Tomorrow at noon? Okay, they will be there, and they will repair your emotions. That would be a nice thing to have, wouldn't it? Oh, so wonderful. I was feeling terrible. I was seething. You've been insulting this and doing this and that, the other, and then they showed up, and their smile was so nice, and then they gave me a back rub, and I felt like I was important, and then this happened, and I told them what it was, and they helped me understand, and showed their empathy, and they're going to do this and this and this, and I'm so glad I'm back to square one and back to center, and my emotional cathedral is back in good shape. You hired a great one. Good job. We're friends again. Wouldn't that be nice? Emotional repair. For the emotional damage that is equal or more severe than any physical damage. You can destroy someone's life, literally, by repeated emotional bashing. Suicide is an epidemic. Why? We're not talking about physical problems. We're talking about sustained emotional abuse that is so hideous that we are one of the only species in the history of the planet to willingly take our own lives to get away from that amount of pain. Does that sound like an ability that would be useful to clear up that kind of pain, where you could go to someone, might be a millionaire, and they can't stand being present to the pain in their own body another minute. The pain coming from heartbreak, from humiliation, from shame, from this, from being decimated, from being dominated, from whatever it is. Do you think it would create value for you to transform that emotional wound into something whole and inspiring, where you leave that person wanting to grow, wanting to contribute their talent, wanting to be more responsible for the community that they now no longer hate but feel inspired to bless with their resources and abilities? That's value. That's an ability, a neglected ability in our culture, which is why we have an incredibly large number of granite countertops and flat screen TVs and iPhones, and an incredibly large number of the population wandering around with bruised, numbed, addicted hearts in various dissociation levels and pain, with no one having a clue, let alone the therapist, about what exactly to do about it. So there's the ability to have impact. And of course, on the same level, if you harm someone emotionally repeatedly and you do not repair it, and you do not see that that body is put back in a way where that person can function emotionally at their best. First of all, you don't get a friend who's functioning at their best. So it's bad for you. You bang into them repeatedly. Secondly, they don't want anything to do with you because you're not able and willing to respond to repair the damage you cause. And as an emotionally illiterate culture, if you don't study emotions, 10x relating, something really useful, empathic listening, nonviolent communication, I mean, there's a range of different things, but it takes work. Human beings are the most difficult interface to connect with because we're so complex. It takes work to develop the ability to discern emotions, the ability to respond to emotions, the willingness to respond to emotions, the ability and willingness to talk about them, the ability and willingness to heal, to repair the fractures at different times. And some people may have the ability to go back and heal childhood trauma, and an entire lifetime shifts. Another person may have the ability to heal present-day sadness. You know, we can develop abilities that are emotionally oriented, in the understanding that every action in human history has been motivated by an emotion. Meaning you take off all feeling, and you stop thinking, and you don't move. Your body will breathe until it dies because you don't feel like getting out of bed to eat. Emotion is a very powerful dimension of the human experience, and the ability and willingness to respond to it is a potent power. Joe Girard was GM's top salesperson by a huge margin. And going back to that Pareto principle, if you can be up at the top, you can make 10, 100 times more money and are sought out. You never have to deal with work. The people at the top of their craft, for example, when you have a recession, you see the billionaires always hire the best. So you may be a carpenter in the 50% mark, and then you have something like the 2008 U.S. housing crisis, where that market collapses 50% overnight for reasons that were not in the control of the contractors and the gardeners and all that got laid off. The market shrinks 50%, which means half the people are laid off. Now, do you think a billionaire lays off the number one sound studio technician who's outfitting their private cinema? No. Because they may or may not decide to sell one of their houses, or they may have gone from being worth $2 billion to only $1 billion. But even with just $1 billion, they can afford to hire the very best, most competent person with the ability to get that job done in their personal home. They may be sending in offshoring workers overseas at their company. But people with money and power and freedom they understand ability. They respect competence. They enjoy hopping on a private jet, flying across the sea, and talking with the number one biologist about this and that and the other. They enjoy that excellence because it's one of the reasons they're at the top. They want to relate to those people. Those people never get laid off, not even in a depression. Because there's always one rich person that's saying, finally, I can get my hands on you. You know, if the economy was booming, I'd never have my chance, but I'm so lucky I get to work with you and talk with you because, you know, you're not so busy. It's not that they go unemployed. And so if you can get into that arena where you're the number one in something relevant, you've got tremendous power and freedom. You're very highly valued. You're never unemployed or unemployable, and you can do whatever you want. You can work when you want, and it's always going to be there. So this is, you know, emotional. There's also mental impact. You know, you talk to someone for an hour and they're confused, divided, irritated because you made absolutely no sense, and that's your mental impact. Talk to someone else for an hour and you understand things that you never saw in your entire life. And they're useful things. And it's like, wow, that's useful negative impact. That's competency. That's the ability and willingness to have positive mental impact. And you can, you know, you have in cult dynamics and stuff like that, you know, there's usually some positive aspect of the cult and some crazy making aspect, and you know, so people get confused and worried and giving away their power and all this, and then if someone can break that down carefully and say it's this bit is good, that bit is toxic, this bit doesn't connect with that bit is okay, and they can do that, they might save that person 6 years of torment in 1 hour. By having the ability and the willingness to elucidate a mental equation that other people were befuddling because fuzzy math makes for good sales with lousy companies and lousy cults. Fuzzy math is the math that says 1 plus this minus that, and you see, and so you should give us $1 million. And we're the guru and da-da-da-da-da. It's like, well, I couldn't quite follow that, but that sounded very impressive. Here's the million. Well, fuzzy math makes for good sales in crappy companies. So you need to, if you can have the ability to elucidate that equation and provide comps. It's like, here's this equation. Now, let's clarify what the goal is. This is the equation, da-da-da-da-da. And if you do it this way, and this way, wow, your whole world opens up. That's mental ability. And mental ability corresponds with articulating talent because consciousness correlates with language. When you think about what are you conscious of, what did I just say? I said, what are you conscious of? I said words. And you had a conscious response by understanding the words. You didn't just understand the thought. You understood the thought through the words. And you understand the energy through the thought and through the words. So consciousness correlates with language. If we do not have the language to say something, or the permission, the ability and willingness, if we don't have the power to speak, we don't have the same mental ability, which means we can't be responsible mentally because we don't have the ability and willingness to respond. And this brings me to, what I think is one of the most important things around this is I built a house at age 23. So let's kind of look through some of the processes of, leading up to this. And we have, as part of our culture, we're given a lot of this as kind of defaults. We might take it for granted. But if you take the phenomena of building, a $200,000 house in current building codes and all that, I mean, you don't just poof, I want a house. You don't have the ability and willingness to do that. A 5-year-old can't just, I want a house. Now, they may have the ability and willingness to cajole grandpa, the billionaire, into giving them a house, in which case the 5-year-old has that ability and willingness as long as the grandpa will go along with it. But I certainly didn't have that. And so, the ability and willingness to make something like a house come about has lots of micro abilities that add up in the synergy. Meaning if you do all these things, then you have the ability to do it. And then if you have the willingness to do it, you have the house. So you have learning language. Can't go into a bank speaking gibberish. You have learning the law. You have to know that in this country, land is divided up into little bits, and there are little lines here, and you can build this high and not this high. You have to understand the law. You have to learn a skill, meaning you don't just get handed money because you exist. We're not at universal income yet, so you have to learn a skill. You have to learn an ability that other people find useful. You then have to sell the skill. You have to go around saying, hey, I've got this skill. It's really useful. It could help you like this and like this and like this. How much will you pay me for it? Okay, so you learn the skill, you sell the skill. You got to save money. You got to get paid. It means you got to have the negotiating ability and all that, And each of these have 100 subcategories. It's not like you just click and learn a language. You may need to get an iPad, a tutor, various things. But you have to save money. Would probably get a bank account. You've got to pay taxes because when it comes to a building loan, they're going to look at your tax returns, and you've got to buy some land, and you've got to get a design, which means, of course, finding a designer, knowing what you want and all that. And you've got to get a loan, and you've got to build the house. Then you've got to keep paying the loan, or it just disappears. If you don't have the ability and the willingness to pay the loan, the house vanishes. It's, usually mostly the banks. You got to repair the house. And so through developing all these abilities with the various willingnesses to do all of those abilities, you can take responsibility for creating and maintaining a house. And if you don't do any of that stuff, poof, no house. It's the same with everything else. When Elon Musk decided to build SpaceX, 10 years ago, it almost didn't exist. It's amazing. And now it's the most significant space company in the world. So bigger than, more important than governments. And how do you do that? It's a constant response pattern. Developing ability, responding to problems, developing new abilities, responding to problems, developing new abilities. Elon Musk talked about starting these companies like eating glass. He said that's what it feels like working 100-hour weeks in 3 companies. He says, I do nothing but solve the worst problems that no one else can solve. My job is like eating glass. It's painful. It hurts. It needs to get done. And I'm the one that does the thing that no one else can figure out how to do. And I work harder. And there's no guarantee of success. And it's painful. It's exhausting. But I'm able and I'm willing to do that, to create these 3 industries. So he gets the best people from all around the world wanting to work with him. So he's worth billions. So one person has changed 3 industries. He had the ability and the willingness to respond to a problem on a global scale. Climate change becoming interplanetary. So that's what was interesting to him. Cut down pollution, create sustainable energy, and have a backup plan by having a lot of technology on another planet in case an asteroid sets us back 50 billion years or 50 million years. Elon thought that was important. He had the ability and willingness to do something about it. He had the ability and willingness to tune everyone else out when they told him he was going to fail. He had the ability to surmount all the various obstacles people kept throwing in his way. And we're likely to be on Mars because of Elon. That's a pretty useful ability. And it's one of the reasons I admire him so much. So the ability and willingness to respond is the core of responsibility. It's the doorway to power, value, freedom, well-being, being an adult. And the adult is the one that looks at the situation and says, how can I respond and make this better? That's what an adult is. The teenager looks at it and says, I don't want to be blamed for me. Don't blame me. I want nothing to do with it. It's not my problem. The child says, help. And the adult says, I have the ability. I've developed the ability. Or if I don't have the ability, I see I can't help in this situation. My friend needed CPR and I couldn't give it to him. I'm going to take a CPR class so that I have an ability to respond next time. Because that's what responsibility is. So I hope you've enjoyed this map. I know I have. And I'll see you around.